All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In tonight's lesson, we're going to be looking at the fertilizer industry. I'm hoping to be able to cover everything in an hour. It is quite a lot to do in a short time, so I'm hoping that we'll manage to cover it and that you'll understand everything. All right, without further ado, let's get going. So the first thing that you need to understand, maybe, is that we used to call the fertilizer industry inorganic chemistry. So if any of your parents at any point say, we never did the fertilizer industry when we were at school, that's nonsense. They did it. They just didn't deal with it from the perspective of fertilizers. They looked at it from the perspective of inorganic chemistry, which is not your organic, so not carbon containing, but anything that isn't carbon containing. So we're going to start by looking at how they've changed it, which is that they actually look at the very strange, but they look at the fertilizer industry from the perspective of plants. All right, so I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that in order to grow plants, we need certain things. So if I imagine a plant that's growing, so here's my pretty little plant, I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that in order for a plant to grow, it needs certain macronutrients. And the macronutrients needed by a plant are nitrogen. No, I lied. Those aren't. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are macronutrients. I'm confusing macro and primary. So our macronutrients are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These macronutrients are what actually make up the cellulose and the structures that make up most of the plants. They're not going to be our biggest point or our biggest focus, but I just need to make sure that you do know where we get these elements from. The carbon we mainly get from carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen we mainly get from water. I've got an interesting question. Do any of you know, and this isn't exactly fertilizer industry, this is a little bit beyond that, but do any of you know where the plant gets the majority of its mass from? So as a tree grows, what makes up the mass of that tree? Any ideas? Anybody who knows what makes up a tree? It's a really interesting question. It is carbon, and where does it come from? Because people used to have this idea that a plant turned soil into tree, and we now know that's complete and utter nonsense, right? There was, I think it's a Dutch physicist, biologist, I don't know what he was, a Dutch scientist, who did an experiment where he took a tree and he grew it for a number of years, and he determined the mass of the soil, the mass of the plant, and a couple of years later, he discovered that the tree had gone up by a number of kilograms, but the soil had only gone down by about 1 kilogram. Does anybody know where the majority of the mass of the tree comes from? It is carbon, but where does that come from? It's from the air. Trees are made out of air. The carbon dioxide that they take in, that they then use under the process of photosynthesis, that forms the main structure that they use. So please note that trees are made out of air. A little bit of an irony there. All right, so those are our macronutrients. Then we've also got to look at the primary nutrients. Now, this is where a lot of our focus goes into. So we're going to be looking at the specific primary nutrients that plants need in order to grow. The first primary nutrient is nitrogen. The second is phosphorus, and the last is potassium. So just in case any of you are rubbish at knowing your symbols, N is nitrogen, P is phosphorus, and K is potassium. The reason that I specifically link these in this order is that the NPK ratio is quite often the way that we write down the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium on our bags of fertilizer. And one of the exercises we're going to be starting off with today looks specifically at that. But what I need to do before then is I need to discuss with you what we use nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for, as well as where we get them, both organically, which is environmentally more sustainable, and inorganically through synthesis and production in industrial factories. So the first thing is, what do we need nitrogen for? We need nitrogen for the growth of a plant and healthy leaves. So if you ever buy a fertilizer that's specifically designed for grass, grass is a leaf. So anything linked to leaves, so your spinach, your lettuce, anything like that, must make sure that it has lots of nitrogen. Nitrogen, very important for growth of the plant as well as healthy leaves. Phosphorus is very important for our roots. Now, I'm going to draw in one of my favorite kinds of roots, although probably not very well at all. There we go, I'll eventually get it in. That is a carrot. And a carrot, the bottom part of it anyway, there's my carrot, is a root. So over here, we know that phosphorus is important for root growth and root development, and it also makes our roots resistant to diseases. So if you want to grow anything that is a seedling, you need lots of phosphorus to make the roots grow. Also, if you're growing something like a potato or carrots or something where the root is the fruit, or the root is where it stores its food, then you're going to want to make sure that that fertilizer is particularly rich in phosphorus. And lastly, we have potassium, and potassium is very important for our flowers. There's a flower. So if you're on a farm where you grow roses, you need to make sure you got lots of potassium. So any plants that produce flowers need those, as well as any fruit. So if you've got an orchard, that's an apple, believe it or not, you need to make sure that you have got potassium. Please note, in an exam, this is examinable, and it's usually going to be examined as part of the multiple choice. So what fertilizer do you need the highest ratio of the three primary nutrients for your particular use? Please note places where we get nitrogen from. We get it from guano. Okay, guano is excrement or poo from bats and a lot of sea birds. So you can get guano from bats, you can get guano from penguins, other things like that. All right, so with the uses, it's only one use, it's the primary use. So everything that I've mentioned, make sure you know it. Okay, so nitrogen we get from guano, as well as we get it usually from ammonium nitrate, which is what we are going to be looking at making today. So ammonium nitrate is one of the primary inorganic. So the top thing that I'm listing here is the organic use. The bottom one is inorganic. Please just note something about guano. People used to think that animals like birds don't need their guano, and they didn't really feel that they were doing anything bad by harvesting bird guano. However, what we now know is that a large number of birds actually use their guano to insulate their eggs. And if you remove the guano, the baby birds inside the eggs die, and we end up having fewer baby birds produced. So please just be particularly aware of this. It is a problem in the Western Cape where people used to go and harvest penguin guano, and now we actually have problems where there's a decrease in the penguin population in certain areas because people were harvesting all of the guano, and there wasn't enough guano to insulate the eggs. Next thing is our phosphorus. Phosphorus you regularly will find in bone meal. Now, just so you know what bone meal is, some of your parents may have talked about putting bone meal particularly in their roses, okay? And bone meal is literally when you go to an abattoir where they kill animals, they often take the meat off the bone, and the bones that are left, they grind it into a fine meal, like millie meal, but this is not bone meal. It's the powder made from bones. All right. We also get phosphorus from ammonium phosphate. Ammonium phosphate is one of the sources of inorganic phosphorus. And then from potassium, it comes from potash. Now, potash is literally what it sounds like. People would burn wood, and right at the end, like if you have a braai at home and you burn wood, at the end you've got that fine ash that remains, that's got potassium in it. Or we could use potassium nitrate. You will notice one thing that is common to almost all fertilizers, and that is nitrogen. So ammonium nitrate has nitrogen in ammonium and in nitrate. Ammonium phosphate, there's nitrogen in the ammonium, and potassium nitrate, there's nitrogen in the nitrate. So nitrogen is very important, mainly because it's important for the growth of a plant. Now, I mentioned to you right at the beginning that we look at an NPK ratio. So quite often on a bag of fertilizer, they will specifically put in a ratio of N to P to K. And then in brackets, they'll give a certain number, which for now I'm just going to call X. You also quite often get told the mass of the fertilizer. So we're going to discuss what each of these things mean. N to P to K is the ratio. So if I've got a ratio of 3 to 2 to 5, that means that if there were a certain percentage, let's make it 100%, then if you add these together, 3 plus 2 plus 5, that's going to give me 10 parts. 3 out of 10 parts is going to be my nitrogen. 2 out of 10 parts is going to be my phosphorus. And 5 out of 10 parts is going to be my potassium. So that is the ratio of the nitrogen to the phosphorus to the potassium that we get. The number that you get given in brackets is the percentage of the fertilizer that is actually nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If we look, for example, at ammonium nitrate as a fertilizer, its formula is NH4NO3. Now that means that some of the mass of ammonium nitrate must be hydrogen and oxygen. So not all of it is going to be just nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. So the percentage by mass, only a certain percentage of the entire bag is going to be N, P, and K. Let's quickly look at a specific example. So if I pick on an example here that's maybe got a ratio of 4 to 1 to 2, and I tell you that we've got a 20 kilogram bag, and the number, please note I'm totally making up these. This is not a real fertilizer, but quite often when I want to make one up, I go and look in the nursery. If you go to the nursery, you'll see that these numbers really are written on the bags of fertilizer. So I may tell you here, for example, that this is 30. So if I now want to ask you, what is the mass of just the nitrogen? The mass of just the nitrogen, well, we count the total number of parts. 4 plus 1 plus 2 gives us 7 parts. The nitrogen is first. Please don't muddle up your P and K. I know how easy it is to do. So to work that out, I'm then going to say, well, 4 parts out of the 7 is nitrogen. 30% of the whole bag is going to be fertilizer, and of that we've got 20 kilograms. So if I multiply all of these together, I will get the mass of nitrogen in the bag. So 4 divided by 7 times 0.3 times 20 tells me that I have got 3,43, because it's 428, 3,43 kilograms of nitrogen. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they are not usually going to ask you to do nitrogen, then phosphorus, then potassium, because in an exam that's testing you on the same skill 3 times. But to make sure that everybody can do this, I'm going to ask you just quickly, if you can all please try and work out for me the mass of potassium. Okay, I'm just quickly checking. I did see there was a question. All right, will the mass of fertilizer always be in kilograms? I've never seen an example where it isn't. If you think about how we actually sell and buy fertilizer, it's usually sold in bags of 2.5, 5, 10, 15, up to probably about 30 or 50 kilogram bags. That's what it's usually sold in. All right, so I'm going to quickly pause sharing. Can I ask everyone to quickly try and work out the mass of potassium? Go for it. All right, please give me a thumbs up when you've done that. Wonderful. Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, please just remember that potassium is the K, phosphorus is the P. All right, so the answer that I've got is 1,71 kilograms because it's 2 parts, okay? So my potassium is 2 parts out of the total of 7 parts times by the 30 out of 100, because that's 30%, times by the 20 kilograms gives me that value. All right. Okay. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to quickly pause sharing for a second. Is everybody happy with this? Okay, brilliant. So what I need to quickly then chat to you about is, why do we need fertilizers? So we've already discussed that plants need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but why don't they just get them from the soil? And it's true that in the olden days, where people used to do subsistence farming and live in one small area, the nutrients that you took out of the soil, you would then excrete and they'd be returned back into the soil in the same space. So people and animals would live in a very small space and they'd consume the nutrients, but they'd also defecate, and those nutrients would go back into the soil. What happens nowadays is big chain food companies do huge amounts of growing of plants. They grow fields and fields of lettuce. Those lettuce plants all take the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium out of the soil. They grow. They then get shipped off to your shops, and then we plant them again. But we don't return those nutrients back into the soil. The way that we return the nutrients back to the soil is either by providing an organic or an inorganic fertilizer. All right. So we may have particular things where the soil doesn't have enough nutrients, and also because big crops are grown so fast that those nutrients don't die. The plants don't die, the things that are eaten don't die and get returned back into the soil for the next generation. In nature, quite often when there are fires, the fires return all the nutrients back to the soil, which is one of the reasons why, if you've ever seen straight after a veld fire, for example, the grass that grows straight afterwards is lush and green and beautiful because it's got all of the nutrients it could want. All right. And that's also why in certain areas, now I'm living in the Western Cape, but fynbos actually needs a fire every, I think it's about 10 to 15 years to burn through the wood and the big plants that are there that have possibly died and not been decayed and broken down, and to return those nutrients back into the soil. It is important. All right. So what we're going to talk about now, I'm just going to make sure I'm in the right place, is we're going to talk about issues related. So I'm not going to go into the processes. I have sent you all, I hope you've seen it. I promise we will get there just now. But I have sent you all a flow chart that looks like this. This is my flow chart. Everything that's in red is the harbor process. It goes all the way down around to that process there. Everything that is in blue is the Oswell process, and everything that is in green is the contact process. Every year, the students that I teach moan that they don't like this layout. And my challenge is, take it as a template and make your own. If you don't like things that bend back on themselves, make one that's linear all the way. This was just the easiest one that I could make. And I promise we are going to get back to this now, but I'm going to stop and instead first discuss with you a little bit about the disadvantages of using fertilizer and the problems that come with it. All right, so let's keep going. We're now going to talk about a process that is one of the negative effects of using inorganic fertilizers. And that's that when we put these fertilizers on the plants, quite often the fertilizers are water soluble in order to be absorbed by the plant's roots. But the fact that they're water soluble also means that if there's lots of rain, they get washed away into bodies of water like rivers or lakes, And in those rivers or lakes, they cause or start a process called eutrophication. And eutrophication is a rather nasty thing, because what effectively happens is that we end up with a buildup or a collection of nitrates or very nitrate-rich water bodies. Usually this doesn't happen in the sea, because the sea doesn't really allow much to grow there because of the amount of salt. But in anything like a lake or a dam, it'll happen. So you will have too much nitrates. Now, just as nitrates are good for plants, they are fantastic for algae. So because you have too much nitrate in the water, what it leads to is it leads to an algal bloom, or a very rapid growth of algae. The reason that the algae grows so fast is for algae, this is like a free-for-all, all-you-can-eat buffet. It's got all of the nitrate it needs, so it's just growing almost with nothing stopping it. However, something does happen that does stop it, is at some point, we reach a point where we've reached too thick a layer of algae. Now, algae is a plant, technically, falls under plant kingdom, and it needs sunlight in order to photosynthesize. And if it doesn't have access to the sun's light, it will stop. So what's happened is that we've built such a thick layer of algae that the sun's light rays cannot penetrate to the bottom. Okay? So what ends up usually happening there is that the algae becomes too thick, can't get sunlight to photosynthesize, and the algae die. Now, as much as many of us will go and say, oh, but it's fantastic. We've got lots of plants growing, and plants are wonderful because plants take in carbon dioxide and they give out oxygen. Go plants. The problem is when plants die, they take in oxygen and they give out carbon dioxide. So when plants die, the opposite happens as they decay. All right? So as the algae dies and it decays, algae decays and it uses up the oxygen in the water. Now, many of you will say, but there's no real reason that we need oxygen in water, except for the fishies. The fish need oxygen to be in water. So as soon as we've got this problem where the algae is decaying now and it's using up the oxygen that's present in the water body, we're going to end up with dead fish and other aquatic life. And that leads to one big problem, which is that it stinks, literally. Okay, so if any of you are rowers or no rowers or driven past a dam or a body of water, I'm sure at some point you've gone past and you thought, gosh, that reeks. Usually it's also when people will go and tell you, don't swim in the dam, it's not safe. All of those are because of eutrophication. So eutrophication effectively is caused by there being too much nitrate in the water, algae growing too fast, algae dying and decaying, using up the oxygen in the water, and therefore there being no more oxygen in the water, so the fish and other animals die. All right, I hope that makes sense. So there are a couple of ways that we can avoid this problem with eutrophication. So first of all, we can use other smart farming techniques. One of the smartest ones is called crop rotation. And what it involves is instead of planting the same crop in the same field every year, you rotate which field you plant which crop in. And usually what people do is they plant legumes, which are peas and beans, in the field in between other plants. Now, legumes are very important because they actually have nitrogen fixing bacteria in nodules in their roots. Legumes are one of the only plants that are able to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into nitrates. So because of that, that's one of the reasons why people often will say if you're vegetarian, you should eat beans and peas and those kind of things. They got a lot of nitrates in them. Nitrogen, important for you to later build protein, okay, which is why they've got protein in them as well. So you could do that. And then some farmers don't even harvest those legumes. They just literally run a machine through them that chops them all up and returns them back into the soil. And then the soil's got some nitrates in it. All right. You could also use organic fertilizers, which tend to be a little bit less soluble in water, and they tend to be things that stay in the soil as opposed to just things that dissolve quickly in the water. You could also farm further away from dams, rivers, lakes, or you could put in your fertilizer at smart times. Part of the problem with fertilizing, if any of you are involved in gardening that you know, is when you fertilize, you've actually got to put in a small amount of water with it. But you don't want to fertilize your farms right before there's a flash flood of rain. You want to make sure that it's decent. All right. So we're now going to look at the negative impacts of eutrophication on three things. We're going to look at the effects on the environment, on humans, and lastly, on the economy. And it's very important that we look at all of these, and in an exam that you pay attention to what the question's asking. If they ask for an effect on the environment and you go and say something about the humans, which are usually, I think, rather pathetic negative impacts, then you're going to not get any marks. You've got to pay attention to which of these you're being asked for. First of all, on the environment, it leads to the contamination of water. This means that if there is too much nitrates in the water, they are bad for animals to drink. Okay, you can't go swimming in them, but that's more of a human effect, and they're not great for people to drink. They also lead to destruction of aquatic life, and they can even lead to things called dead zones, which is where, because there is too little oxygen to support life, nothing grows. And we can also, because we destroy life, break down the ecosystems. You got to remember that that little fishy does not live in isolation. That fish may be a food source for another animal. And if the fish all die out at the same time, that animal is not going to have food. So you can have all of those as a knock-on effect because of eutrophication. All right, for humans, we can have poor quality drinking water or no drinking water that's healthy. It can ruin our recreational, I always love this, recreational areas. So you can no longer go to the dam anymore because the dam stinks. Okay, so you also wouldn't want to go sailing on the dam or skiing or rowing, any of those. And then the most commonly given solution that most of my students like to give is that it can cause blue baby syndrome. Now, I just quickly want to jump a little bit more to discuss what blue baby syndrome is. So if there is a lady who is drinking water, pregnant lady, unfortunately men, this doesn't count for you, but if there is a pregnant lady drinking water from a water body that has excess nitrates in it, it means that the fetus that is growing in her uterus is getting too much nitrate. And that fetus, when it is born, will have deformations with its hemoglobin and its red blood cells, which means that the baby cannot carry oxygen properly in the red blood cells. That leads to something that they call blue baby syndrome, which means that when the baby is born, instead of being lovely and pink and rosy as babies should be, because it's got oxygenated blood, its blood is deoxygenated, so it looks blue. Literally. That is why they call it blue baby syndrome. Unfortunately, this leads to the death of a baby. If a baby cannot breathe, technically they can breathe, but they can't get the oxygen that they need when they breathe, they will die. All right. So those are all of the effects on humans. Please, with blue baby syndrome, if you state it, please make sure that you actually link it to nitrates in the drinking water, causing an issue with the oxygen carrying capacity of the baby's blood. Okay. So in the economy, it can lead to issues in fishing. So if we've got fishing industries that fish, for example, in a dam or a lake and all your fish die, you're not going to be able to produce fish. And the second thing is that it could affect tourism because your recreational areas are not so nice. So if you're wanting to go on holiday, you're not going to want to go to a place that stinks of dead, rotting fish. That's not quite so appealing. All right, so you do need to know about eutrophication. Please do not forget the word. Eutrophication is a bit of a tricky word to remember, and it's one of the common things that they are going to ask you. It's also one of those words that's going to be on the tip of your tongue and you can't remember it. So practice writing it out a few times so that you're sure you've got it. All right, I'm going to just quickly stop sharing and make sure that I'm still with all of you. All right, is everybody still with me? Does this still make sense? Yes? Wonderful. I'm just going to wait for your hands to go out quickly down before I ask the next question. Okay, so I'm waiting. Hands down. All right. I wanted to ask if anybody has learned anything new today. So I know that some of you may have done this section when you were in lockdown. Does anyone yet learn something new today? Sometimes it may just be one of, I think, the anecdotes as to how the bits work. So sometimes you may have been taught exactly how it works, but you may not have figured out everything around it. Okay, what we're now going to do in the next 25 minutes is hopefully cover all of the industrial processes. So let's get going. All right, if I can do fertilizers in an hour, that is fantastic. I'm thrilled. So there are three different inorganic processes that you need to know about. The Haber process, the contact process, and the Oswell process. So these are our industrial processes. You will usually be examined on two of them, but sometimes even one, and then they just go into detail, and they'll then ask you to do an NPK calculation, ask a little bit about eutrophication, those kind of things. So the first that we're going to deal with is the Haber process. And the Haber process is also technically called the Haber-Bosch process, but unfortunately Bosch's name gets dropped off it more often than not. All right, and what the Haber process does is it is the process to make ammonia. You've all probably smelt ammonia. Ammonia smells like old school handy Andy. It's got a very cleaning smell. And the reaction for the Haber process is one step only. It's nitrogen reacts with hydrogen to produce ammonia. This process is catalyzed by an ion catalyst. You need to learn that. So anything that's a catalyst, we write above the arrow. So this is our ion catalyst. Okay, you need to know that. You need to know where we get our nitrogen from, and you need to know where we get our hydrogen from. So our nitrogen comes from the fractional distillation of liquid air. So basically what we do is we take air, like air, we take it, we compress it, we cool it down, and we turn it into a liquid called liquid air. We usually, before we compress it, we filter it to remove dust, and then in the air, you're going to have 79% nitrogen, about 20% oxygen, and all of the other 1% is every other kind of gas that you get. Now, all of those gases have slightly different boiling points. So what we do is we then slowly but surely heat up the gas. And when we're talking about heating up the gas, we're talking about a boiling point that's negative, I think it's negative, I want to say 79, but it's not. It's a very low negative number, okay? So when we liquefy the air, we're taking it to a low negative temperature, and then we slowly but surely heat it up. And as we heat it up at a certain temperature, nitrogen will turn from the liquid into the gas. We'll then take that gas, recondense it as pure nitrogen. You need to know that nitrogen is made by the fractional distillation of liquid air. You need to know that hydrogen is made in the Sasol process. And you need to know that it's produced. I'm going to show you the full reaction for it just now. I don't actually have it here, but we effectively are going to produce the hydrogen gas in the Oswell process. All right, I'll show you the reaction just now. So in fact, let me do it right now. If I show you my diagram, you'll be able to see where I got it from. Okay, so far I've said that the air through the fractional distillation of liquid air gives you nitrogen. And the Oswell production here is that if we have coal and steam, so for example, if we take carbon and react it with steam, there's a gas there to show that it's steam, we will produce carbon monoxide and hydrogen gas. Please note, carbon monoxide, not so good, poisonous, can kill you. So what we then do is we take the carbon dioxide and we react it with more steam to produce carbon dioxide. Once again, not so great, can cause global warming, but better than can kill you. All right, and that gives off hydrogen. You can combine these two reactions into one, but more often than not, this isn't asked. But it is important, just in case it is asked, that you know it, that produces my hydrogen. So the nitrogen and the hydrogen react together to produce ammonia. All right, back to my other slide. Okay, so jumping back to here, you need to know where both of those come from. You need to know that the catalyst, which is iron, speeds up the rate of reaction. And you need to know that because this is a reversible reaction, which means it's in equilibrium, we need to try and push for the forward reaction. In an industrial process, you never want to reach equilibrium. That means that the product that you're trying to make to sell has been broken down. So over here, to push the forward reaction, you will see that all of these are gases, especially if I write it in. All of those are gases. And on this side, starting materials, we've got 4 moles of gases. On this side, we've only got 2 moles of gases. So one of the ways that we can increase the rate of reaction, possibly, is to increase the pressure, okay? And the other thing that we do need to know here is that this reaction is exothermic. And because of that, we would favor the forward reaction by decreasing the temperature. But there's a catch. If you favor the forward reaction and you only produce ammonia, it would be at a you'd have to decrease the temperature to get there, which means that the rate of reaction would actually decrease. So instead of using a really low temperature, what they found is that the most optimal temperature to use is a moderate temperature of 450 degrees Celsius. So 450 degrees Celsius is the optimum temperature for this reaction to occur. So if I continue back to what I was sharing over here, you'll see there are the full details over there. The delta H of reaction is -92. You don't need to memorize that. You just need to know that it's exothermic. You need to know that because it's exothermic, we're not going to use a very hot temperature. A low temperature would actually work better, which is why we use the moderate temperature. We use an iron or an iron oxide catalyst. You can use either. And we use a high pressure of 200 atmospheres to push the forward reaction to occur. That produces our ammonia. Now, this ammonia is going to be used in 2 reactions that I'm going to show you later to make 2 different fertilizers. I'm going to show you how we make ammonium nitrate and how we make ammonium sulfate. And both ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate need ammonia as one of their starting materials. So this reaction goes down, round, and the ammonia goes into both of those 2 to produce 2 fertilizers. All right, quickly stopping sharing. Is everybody with me on the Haber process to make ammonia? Please make sure you remember which process makes which of your chemicals, so which compounds. So you need to not get confused as to which process makes ammonia. Popular multiple choice questions, and amazingly enough, people still get them wrong. All right, let us continue. We're now going to be looking at the second industrial process, which is the Oswell process. And the Oswell process is used to make nitric acid. Okay, so the Oswell process has 3 steps. Step number 1 has a name, and you need to know its name. It is called the catalytic oxidation of ammonia. They often group together the Haber process and the Oswell process because the Haber process makes the ammonia, which we then oxidize in the Oswell process. So over here, we're going to take our ammonia that we made. We're going to react it with oxygen, oxidation, add in oxygen, ammonia there. We're going to use a platinum catalyst, and we are going to produce nitrogen monoxide and water. Now, you are going to need to write a balanced equation. This one is one of the harder equations to balance. So what I've always done that makes my life really easy is I remember one number. I remember that there is a 4 there. If there is a 4 there are 4 nitrogens, so I put a 4 there. Also, that means that there are a total of 12 hydrogens, which means I know I put a 6 there. And from here, I can now see I've got 4 oxygens plus 6 oxygens. I've got 10 oxygens, so I put a 5 there. I do not memorize the whole thing off by heart. I remember one number, and then I know how to balance. Okay? So over here, we have made nitrogen monoxide, and we have made water. Please note, nitrogen monoxide then gets further reacted. So step number 1 was to make the nitrogen monoxide. Step number 2 doesn't have a name, but we're effectively going to take the nitrogen monoxide and we're going to oxidize it further. So we're putting in more oxygen, and what we're going to produce is nitrogen dioxide. Now, since we started with 1 oxygen and we end up with 2, each nitrogen is only gained 1, so we've got to balance this by putting a 2 in front of each of those. Very important. Yes. Okay. Sorry, there was a question, will always be 4, 5, 4, 6. That is the balanced equation. Those are the products, and that's how we balance it. So some people find that they memorize the entire thing. As I said, I memorized one coefficient and figure out the rest. Over here, just a couple of important things. Nitrogen dioxide is a brown gas. You need to know that. Sometimes it may be a hint that they use to tell you something that's happening. And if you don't know that the brown gas is nitrogen dioxide, you're going to get lost as to what the question is. And then the last step has 2 options. Basically, we're going to be taking the nitrogen dioxide and we're going to be making our nitric acid. But depending on the ratio of nitrogen dioxide to water, we can have one of 2 reactions, and you need to know both. So the one option has 3 nitrogen dioxides reacting with water, and that produces 2 HNO3 and NO. Now this nitrogen monoxide that we make will get recycled. It will go back into this step, oxidized again, turned into nitrogen dioxide, and then we'll repeat the process. So any extra nitrogen monoxide that's produced can be recycled back into the second step. All right. NO2 is brown. Okay, NO is colorless. Over here, the second option, which is a big OR because it's the one or the other, is if we have 4 NO2s plus 2 H2O plus a little bit of oxygen, we can go straight to 4 HNO3. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, these are regrettably things that you need to learn. So you need to learn that you have ammonia reacting with oxygen to giving you nitrogen monoxide and water. You need to know that the nitrogen monoxide then gets oxidized to produce nitrogen dioxide. You need to know that the nitrogen dioxide then reacts with water to produce nitric acid and nitrogen dioxide, or the nitrogen dioxide reacts with water and extra oxygen to produce the nitric acid. I think that this one at the bottom here is preferable because you don't have to do a recycling end stage, but it does mean that you've got to get the right balance of oxygen in here. It's effectively us kind of doing this step a little bit more to react the extra nitrogen dioxide all the way to completion. Please, you need to know that either of these are options because they can choose to do one or the other, and you need to be ready for both. With this section on fertilizers, an incredibly large amount of your inorganic processes is straightforward memorizing and learning. All right. Okay, I'm going to quickly jump back to my cheat sheet to show you how this goes on the cheat sheet. You obviously don't need to like it, but I just want you to appreciate it that it's there. So the ammonia that we used is the starting process. Along with oxygen, we have the catalytic oxidation of ammonia. Please note, as I mentioned, this uses a platinum catalyst and a moderately high temperature. Extra bit of information there. This is the nitrogen dioxide that we produce. Remember, the other thing that we produced was water, but I don't actually use it any further, so I don't show it. The nitrogen monoxide gets oxidized to produce nitrogen dioxide, which we have there. We also add in water. Sometimes we add in oxygen as well. There are our two options of reactions, and that produces nitric acid. All right. Now, if our nitric acid reacts with ammonia, we can produce ammonium nitrate. So quite often in an exam, they'll start from this point and make you work backwards to both the Oswell process as well as the Haber process. All right. Last reaction that we're going to do for this evening is the contact process. I'm going to go back to my whiteboard and we're going to quickly go through this. All right. So this is reaction number 3, which is the contact process. The contact process is called the contact process because it uses a contact catalyst. And the contact catalyst is our vanadium pentoxide, V2O5. That is the reason why it's called the contact process. So the contact process is used to make sulfuric acid, H2SO4, and it has 4 steps. Step number 1 doesn't really have a name. Sulfur gets burnt in oxygen to produce sulfur dioxide. Please be careful. Sulfur dioxide is a colorless gas, but it's also a relatively dangerous. We often describe it as being a toxic gas. All right. So it forms quite often fumes, and you'd usually do something like this even in industry in a sealed space because people can get ill if they breathe in too much sulfur dioxide. So after this step, the sulfur dioxide gets washed to remove impurities, and the wet sulfur dioxide is then dried with using sulfuric acid as a dehydrating agent. That's just a little bit of extra information. It's not one of the things I'm writing down. So you can mention here that this gets washed and then it gets dried and your sulfuric acid is dehydrating. Then we have our sulfur dioxide getting oxidized again to produce sulfur trioxide. This uses vanadium pentoxide, which is our contact catalyst. All right. Please note sulfur trioxide is also a colorless gas. All right. So the vanadium pentoxide, they come through multiple layers of the catalyst, and that's where it's the contact process. There's multiple layers of contact through the contact catalyst, and that's where it gets its name from. Step number 3 is we're going to take this, now we just got to pause here. If I took the sulfur trioxide and I reacted it with directly with water, I would be able to make sulfuric acid, but I would make very dangerous fumes, which mean we've got a very corrosive gas that is in acid, very dangerous. So what we do is we don't want to form fumes, so instead we make something called oleum. We take our sulfur trioxide, we react it with sulfuric acid. Yes, we react it with the stuff we're going to make, because that way it safely stores it as H2, now I've just got to be careful, 2 hydrogens, 2 sulfurs, 7 oxygens. And this is called oleum or pyrosulfuric acid. All right. Just wait a second. I did see there was a question. Vanadium pentoxide. I shall write it out for you. Vanadium pentoxide. Vanadium is an element, V, and the pentoxide is because there are 5 oxygens. All right. So this oleum or pyrosulfuric acid makes this a very safe chemical to be transporting. Because if you transport sulfuric acid, it's highly corrosive. You have a car crash and you got sulfuric acid all over the road, it's a very dangerous thing to have. So what we do here is we then take, last step, we take our H2S2O7, we react it with the water that we wanted to react the SO3 with directly, but it would have been too dangerous, and that makes 2H2SO4. So we get back the one sulfuric acid that we put in there, and we get back the one that's formed when that combines with the water. Please, I'm just going to quickly write out here that the reason that we have to do the extra step and not just jump from here to here is if we reacted those two together. Sorry, just give me a second. I've got to find what I was going to say. It is very exothermic, or too exothermic, produces too much heat, and the H2SO4 is therefore a mist, which is very dangerous. Okay, also we'd need to then go and take that mist and try and turn it back into a liquid, and it's very aerosolized. It's very hard to get it back to particles. All right, so that is how we get our H2SO4. All right, I'm going to quickly jump back to what I'd showed you earlier to make sure that you can follow my flow diagram here. So we've got sulfur and oxygen through the oxidation of sulfur giving us sulfur dioxide. We have the sulfur dioxide and more oxygen reacting together to give us sulfur trioxide. The sulfur trioxide is then reacted with sulfuric acid to give us oleum, and that's to prevent the formation of sulfuric acid vapors. There's our oleum. You do need to know the chemical formula for oleum. It has been asked before. We then react the oleum with water to produce sulfuric acid. Some of that sulfuric acid gets transported back to this step, where it then gets reacted again with more sulfur trioxide to make oleum, and it repeats the step. Now the last two reactions are these two, the ones that I've got in yellow, where we effectively take two of the products that we've made, react them together, and produce our product. So I'm going to quickly share back to my whiteboard. All right. So the two reactions that you do need to know is you do need to know how we make ammonium nitrate. And you do need to know how we make ammonium sulfate. So ammonium nitrate is made from ammonia and nitric acid. Please learn that. It's an easy thing to know. Anything with ammonium is made from ammonia. I've just shown you how to make nitric acid, which is HNO3, and how to make sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4. With the ammonium nitrate and the ammonium sulfate, you're literally going to merge these two together. Now here, we're going to make ammonium, which is NH4+, and nitrate, which is NO3-. So it's just NH4, NO3. NH4+, NO3-. This is my thinking step. When we make ammonium sulfate, it is NH4+ and SO4, SO4 2-, which means that the formula is actually, and I'm just going to swap pens, there we go, going to be NH4 2SO4. And those are the balanced equations that you're quite often going to be asked to write out. Haven't balanced the bottom one, I left off a 2. There we go. So those now are the balanced equations that you're going to be expected to know. Ladies and gentlemen, this is, amazingly enough, the fertilizer industry. It is one of the easiest sections, in my opinion, if you have got a good memory, because a lot of it is memorizing. A lot of it is being able to regurgitate exactly what's written there. I'm going to tell you one of my crazy tricks that I used to use a while ago. And one of those tricks that I used to use a while ago was that I actually, when I did these reactions, I used to write them on the back of my exam papers. So while I was doing my matric exams, I would actually, at the end of every exam, once I was done, if I had extra time, particularly in some of those papers where there's a lot of time, a lot of you aren't allowed to leave your prelims early, was that I'd sit and I'd write out these reactions. I'd write out the full processes on the back of my Afrikaans exam script, on the back of any exam script where I had extra time. And I found that that was a really useful way for me to start memorizing these, was to actually practice writing them out and see if I could write out all of the steps of the Haber, one step of the Haber process, all of the steps of the contact and the Oswell process. All right, ladies and gentlemen, are there any last minute questions? All right, wonderful. Have an absolutely wonderful evening, and I shall see you all again next week on Tuesday. Bye-bye.